So, it's an exciting time we live in, huh? Yeah? Excitement can come from a number of different sources when you stop and think about it. It can be driven by just sheer stimulation, by joy, by anticipation, by trepidation, by fear, by terror. And I guess I would begin by saying we live in a time where all of those things are true, right? All of them are true. And I think the conference is appropriately named, choice. Choice. I think we stand at a time, we live at a time, I believe, that's one of those pivot points in history. They only come around so often. I'd argue that maybe the last time that there existed a time like this was perhaps 200 years ago, in the transition from the 18th into the 19th century and the move to the industrial world, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Because I believe fundamentally that we stand at a crossroads. Show you this not just to shamelessly self-promote my own book, but I do that as well. I do that. But I believe that we really are at one of those times, and that over the next decade, and this isn't a 50-year proposition that we're talking about. I think that the transformation is going to have to happen in a substantial way over the next decade. And what that means that it really is on you. It's not about just getting in and starting a nice career, and maybe 20 years out you can take a risk. The time is now. So even though it's choice, right? And it shows many arrows there, right? I will argue that it's increasingly no longer really choice. We could choose, but some of those pathways lead to oblivion, and we already know that. So I would argue increasingly it's necessity, not choice. And then the question becomes, what do we do, right? And where are the leverage points? So of course I'm going to argue, I wouldn't be standing here otherwise, right? And the book wouldn't be Capitalism at the Crossroads if I wasn't going to argue that the enterprise sector, the business sector, is the leverage point. And I absolutely believe that that's the case. That's where we can really drive the kinds of innovations that are going to be needed. So I'd like to talk to you today about that vision, first of all, but then maybe something more specific, maybe many things more specific about how to actually think about doing that. Because I know that all of you are being challenged to actually identify and develop and propose an initiative, right? So we'll spend a little bit of time, hopefully, talking about things that might be relevant to that. And I know there's also some time at the end. And if we've got during the discussion, please, if you have a burning question, feel free to raise your hand. I know that there are microphones in the audience here. And then there'll be some time in the end. I know there'll be some cards that will be passed around. So if there are questions and that sort of thing, and those will be collected, and we'll have some time to talk about those toward the end. And I know, 2 hours is a long time, but hopefully I won't totally bore you during that period of time. So we'll try to keep it lively a little bit, okay? All right. So many people would ask the question, why now? Why is now the time? You think about it, every generation thinks they live at the most important time. Right? If you read history, every generation thinks that they live at the most important time. And the historians actually have a term for that. They call it chronocentrism. Have you ever heard? It's kind of a technical term. Have you ever heard that one? And you think about it, and if you read history, it's always, this is like a decisive point in human history. Back 2,000 years ago, people felt that way. Every generation feels that way. But what I want to argue is that I believe that we actually do live at the most important time. And I actually have some empirical evidence for that. Being an academic, right? You have to have evidence. So this will be evidence-based, at least at some level. And so let me start, no presentation by an academic would be complete without a formula, right? So has anyone seen this formula before? The so-called IPAT formula? Yeah, anyone seen it? No? No closet environmentalists here, huh? So I'm actually, I'll give attribution. This is another one of the things that academics do, is attribute work where the citation is reserved. And so this actually came from the Ehrlichs, Paul Ehrlich, who wrote a book back in the late 60s called The Population Bomb. It was one of those big books that really helped to generate the whole environmental movement in the late 60s and into the early 70s. And I've kind of taken some poetic license with it, but the same basic concept is still there and the formula hasn't changed. And essentially it says the following. It's really very simple-minded. That the human impact on the planet, and you'll notice that I talk about environment together with social issues, because I think they travel together. The human impact on the planet is a function of three things. Obviously, population, right? More people, more impact. That's kind of obvious. The level of affluence, which historically has been a proxy for how much stuff people use, buy, waste, throw in the landfill, how much energy they use, and so forth. So, what do we know about that? All right, I'll answer the question. There's actually been a lot of work done on this, right, over the past several dozen years. And I think one of the things we now know pretty clearly, and I would steer you to, there's a very interesting, scientifically legitimate and credible group which has really brought together a lot of this work, and it's called the Global Footprint Network. Some of you may have heard of this. You can Google it and go to their website. And so they've developed a measure of human footprint. And you can do it for you as an individual. What's my footprint? And it's kind of how much of the earth do I use, to support my life? How much land area, how much soil, how much waste do I generate? And you can calculate that as kind of a portion of the earth, which is what they've done. And you can take it up to your family, to your company, to your community, to your country, and then of course the whole world. And if you look at that calculation, we as a species kind of crossed the carrying capacity somewhere back around the mid-1980s. And if you look at where we are right now, it's just about 1.5 Earths. In other words, if we put that in business terms, we're running the planet at about 150% capacity. Right? You get away with that for a while, just by spending down the capital, which we've been doing now for a while. But eventually, you hit the wall. You hit the wall. So we already know that the human impact on the planet is more than it should be. Every natural system is under assault or in decline. I mean, that much, unless you deny the scientific process, and some people do, there's just no arguing with that, right? I mean, that's really all about physics and chemistry and biology and so forth, and those are actually real sciences. So we know that that's the case, whether it's marine fisheries or whether it's coral reefs or whether it's agricultural soils or whether it's native forests or whether it's climate, you name it, every natural system is being stressed at this point, potentially beyond its limits. And we know that when you take natural systems out like that and really put them under stress, eventually they cross a threshold and they start doing crazy things, right? I mean, they tip into a new zone, and we don't know exactly when or if that's going to happen, but we're kind of running that experiment real time right now. So we know that that's where we are in terms of human impact. Already more than it should be. What's the human population of the planet today? I hear a bunch of mumbles. We're told that it's going to cross like 7 billion this year, right? And Do you ever wonder how we know? You know, at some level, you know, I live in the U.S., and you know, we're told that the population is now 308 million or something like that. But we have a really hard time in the U.S. even getting a good census, you know. But anyway, that's beside the point. That we're told that the population is going to cross the 7 billion mark this year. So I'm a baby boomer, as you may have guessed. And so post-war years, you know, is when I was born. What was the human population then? Let's say 1950. I wasn't born in 1950, but let's say that. What was the population then? Approximately. 4. I hear 3, I hear 4. We're told that it was around 2. Around 2. So when I was born, it was around 2.2. So we'll round it off to 2. Round it off to 2. So in my lifetime, right, the population has gone from 2 to 7 this year. If I live to be a ripe old age, like knock on wood, I might live to see 8 or even 9 billion people in the world. I mean, think about that for a minute. It took all of human history, you know, however long you believe that to be, up until about the time of the Industrial Revolution and the American Revolution, you know, kind of the late 18th century, to get to 1 billion, right? And then from that time until the time I was born to get to 2. And then in my lifetime, the human population has gone from 2 to 7, and it could go to 9 billion in one lifetime. Nothing like that has ever happened before in the history of the planet, right? Let alone just human history. So I would argue that that's pretty unique, you know, and that's some reasonable rationale for saying that we live at the most important time ever. You know? And when you stop and think about it, the only way we're going to stabilize the human population, maybe somewhere around 8 or 9, is if we generate a whole lot more well-being, economic security, economic empowerment, improvement in quality of life and education. In other words, social and economic uplift for the 4 or 5 billion people in the world that currently reside at the base or bottom of the income pyramid. Because we know that's where all the population growth happens, right? I mean, that much we know for sure. So the only way you stabilize the human population at 8 or 9 billion is to create a lot of uplift at the base of the pyramid. And that means generating a lot more growth. I mean, let's be honest with it, with ourselves. That's what it means. If we don't do that, then it's going to be difficult to stabilize population, especially, you know, in poor communities out in rural areas. It's going to keep driving migration to megacities, and it's more slums, shanty towns, and favelas, right? I mean, you guys have been wrestling with that one for a while. That's the reality. So population could increase another, we'll say 50%. It could. But in order to stabilize population, we're going to have to grow, you know, we're going to have to grow more. We're going to need to grow affluence, say, 5-fold over what it is now. You know, increase economic activity 5-fold over what it is now. But you don't have to be a mathematical genius to figure out that if we do it the same way, right, if we just use the current technology or some slightly improved version of that, the same business strategies, the same business models, if we just project what we're doing out and try to lift the world that way, that it creates environmental collapse. I mean, it's a meltdown situation because, as I said at the beginning, we're already at an operating rate at 150% capacity. We're hitting the wall, right? I mean, and we're living it right now. We're in the midst of it. It's a slow motion crash, right? Because geological time is pretty long. So the kind of stuff that's going on out there, you know, at least in terms of the history of the world, is like a blink of an eye. But for us, it kind of unfolds, it seems gradually, you know, these kind of crazy events that are happening out there in the world. But that's what's going on. And of course, it has social repercussions. So, you know, how are wildfires, you know, and floods and so forth related to the Arab Spring? You know, well, actually, probably are some connections, you know, they have to do with things like food prices and so forth. But, you know, we have to be systems thinkers to see all that. But the fact is we're in the midst of this slow motion train wreck, you know, that this formula summarizes. And it's for that reason that I would say we live at the most important time in human history. And that if we're going to get after this, which I think we have to, and we still have a chance to do that, I think, we have to figure out where's the leverage point. And I think most of us would agree that it wouldn't be wise to try to say, well, let's just reduce the human population from the current 7 billion down to 2. We probably wouldn't like that very much. Could happen, I suppose, right? I mean, if things really go bad, and you know, and we continue to pursue one of those pathways on the choice diagram. You know, similarly, the idea that, well, we just need to take all of the wealth from these rich people, you know, and redistribute it to the poor. That's the way we can solve it, and then cap growth, right? I mean, so it's sort of the back of the caves argument. Most people I know are not really excited about that proposition either. And so that really only leaves one variable in the formula, right? Which is the T. And when you stop and think about it, the T is really what business is all about. The T is the way in which, the means, the mechanism by which we create wealth. So the challenge we have then is how do we move T to the denominator in this formula? We got to change the formula, right? T needs to divide the impact, not multiply it. That's really what this is all about. And that's our opportunity as entrepreneurs, as business people. That's the role of business. Now, business can't do it alone, right? Business has to do it in partnership with civil society and government and so forth. But it's only business, in my view, that has the resources, the technology, the global reach, you know, the capability to generate, to create this kind of change and generate this level of uplift. I just don't see how it happens otherwise. But it's going to have to look very, very different than the way in which we've gone about generating economic growth in the past in order to move T to the denominator, right? It means that T is going to have to change dramatically, 10x, 20x, 40x, maybe more. We really have to be thinking about regenerative models, right, that actually restore natural systems and include everyone at the same time. That's a huge challenge, but it's also a huge opportunity. And I believe that all of this is going to unfold over the course of the next decade or two. It's going to have to, which means you guys really live right at that pivot point. I mean, you're in the epicenter of it, and you need to be the solution. You know, you can't wait around. Now's the time. You can't wait around. You can't wait 20 years until you have a comfortable career, you know, in order to risk, you know, taking a chance. Now is the time. Does it make sense? These aren't new problems, right? I mean, this is a quote from, I don't know if you know Barbara Tuchman. A great book called good, it went away. Called The Proud Tower, about the 19th century. Oop, I already gave it away. Industrial society gave men, you can tell it's old, right, because it says men. The industrial society gave men new powers and new scope, while at the same time building up new pressures in prosperity and poverty, in growth of population and crowding of cities, and antagonisms of classes and groups, and separation from nature and from satisfaction of individual work. Does that sound familiar? But then the rest of the quote is, by the time he left the 19th century, he had as much unease as ease. Right? In other words, we're not grappling with problems that we haven't known about before. When you think about it, it was really the industrialization process which started in the late 18th century, but really went into high gear during the 19th century. That was the genesis of all this, right? That's what allowed population to soar the way that it has. And like all things, you know, the industrialization solved a lot of problems, but it created new ones. That's a rule in human endeavor, right? That any new initiative that you undertake will always solve some problems, and will always create new ones, and a lot of those new ones are going to be unanticipated, right? That's the law of unintended consequences. And only now are those unintended consequences or those negative side effects reaching those scale and scope that they're starting to overwhelm us. But we knew about them even then, right? When you think about it, that's why during the 19th century we saw for the first time, the whole concept of communism, right, was born during the 19th century. The labor movement, the conservation movement, right? Most of these things really sprang up during the 19th century. And then a big movement of anarchism, in the late 19th century, lots of assassinations and bombings and stuff, especially the late 19th century. A lot of people thought that was the most important time. And then into, the explosion of World War I and so forth. A lot of people thought that was the most important time in human history. They sure felt it at that point. Now we have evidence to show that ours is. So this isn't new, right? Karl Polanyi wrote about this transformation. It's called The Great Transformation, for those of you that know Polanyi's work. It's a wonderful book, and he's talking about how much, industrialism just completely transformed the way people live. It's like the whole field of sociology is about this. The transition from being primarily rural to an industrial employee in a large industrial enterprise, just how much that transformed life in all of its forms. This is really the whole topic of this. And I guess I believe now that we're at another one of those transformations. This is the next great transformation that we're in now. Because you think about it, markets are as old as human beings. Right? There have always been markets. People have always traded. For as long as humans have walked the planet, that's been the case. But the concept of corporations and companies, that's newer. Right? The first corporations were these chartered trading companies, like the most famous one being the East India Company, right? The British East India Company, which colonized, India and a lot of other parts of the world. But the Dutch had them, and the French and the Belgians and the Spanish, they all had these crown chartered corporations, which were designed mainly to go extract wealth, right? They were instruments of imperialism, to grant monopoly power, and a lot of these people involved, and certainly the crown, made a lot of money by doing that. Well, that was the first form of corporation. And you think about it, the American experiment, the impetus for the American Revolution, was really a rebellion against this corporate form. When you come right, because the United States, all of the Americans, right, were settled by these corporations. That was what they were. The Hudson Bay Company in the U.S., the Virginia Bay Company, the Massachusetts Bay Company, these were all crown corporations. And Adam Smith, famously, right, the whole notion of the free enterprise system is premised on the idea that we can't have these large monopolistic corporations. What we need are small companies where people have access to full information so they can compete against each other. And that's how you get positive outcomes, right? That's the invisible hand. So it was really in reaction against these large chartered corporations that the whole concept of free enterprise really took root, certainly the roots of modern economics. But over the course of the 19th century, the rules kind of got changed again, right? And in the U.S., initially with the railroads, and then with the oil companies and the automobile companies and a lot of others, you began to see large industrial corporations emerge. The Supreme Court, kind of granted more and more rights for, they could live as long as they want, they could buy other companies, there's joint stock, there's limited liability, and ultimately there's corporate personhood. And so lo and behold, by the turn of the century, it's the industrial corporate model really that reigns supreme. And all that happened, when you think about it, in the space of about 50 years, from say 1860 to about 1910, is when that model really, it didn't exist before 1860. But that's kind of that's our world today still. But as we've seen, there's been plenty of continuous it's been kind of through pulses, right, of social backlash, of rebellion, starting with Adam Smith, but then continuing right on through the 19th century, as I've already described. But then we had, the hiatus of World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, and out of that comes now a world that's more dominated by the Americans, right, after the Second World War. But none of these underlying problems went away, right? In fact, they just continued to mount. to the point where now this is what we see happening. Right? In my view, that's why we're all sitting in this room, because we're all participants in this next sort of beastie experiment to figure out how we get to the third form of corporation. That the industrial model is in its last stages. It just can't continue. So we're participants in the process of the creation of the next form of enterprise. We can call it social business, we can call it sustainable enterprise. It really doesn't matter what the label is. What's important is what the DNA of that enterprise is. And it begins with the fact that it's fundamentally premised on solving real problems in the world, right? First and foremost. That it's about, the purpose of the business is to solve social and environmental problems, to really be of service. And more we see it's kind of coming from the ground up, right? That there's a new kind of bottom-up, reverse innovation, aspect to all this, and I'll talk a whole lot more about that. And we have social entrepreneurship, we have social business, we have corporate social responsibility, we have green business, we have sustainable enterprise. There are all these different kind of entry points, but they're all reflections of the same basic thing. This is really what we're talking about here, and that's why we're all in the room. And we're participating in the creation of this thing, and that's the good news. And the bad news, as I've said before, is that we no longer have much choice, and there's not much time. All right, we're going to have to do it under some time pressure now. Does that make sense? So, sorry, but I think sometimes the kind of rooting things in historical context can be worthwhile. Because then you understand then more about, when you're looking at your watch, why it's important to do what you're doing. So, this new notion of social or sustainable business has some fairly simple principles, I think. One, which my good friend and colleague John Elkington, kind of coined a couple of decades back, is the idea of the triple bottom line. We can talk about double or triple bottom line. Let's talk about triple bottom line. And what's underneath that? I mean, the idea is that there are some philosophies out there, we'll call them isms, whether it's capitalism or environmentalism or socialism. They're kind of existing ideologies, and the problem is over the last 100 years, and certainly over the last 20 or 30, there's been a tendency to take them to the extreme. You get the adherence to these ideologies, and they want to push it to the point where it just becomes absurd. So you push capitalism to the extreme, and you end up with a triumph of commerce over community and the environment. You just throw everything else away. All that's important is letting companies do whatever they want. It's ridiculous. But socialism, we now know, pushed to the extreme, you end up with a triumph of community, or the government for that matter, over individuals. And it tramples individual rights and freedoms, taken to the extreme. Environmentalism, back to the caves, right? The triumph of nature over people, which is absurd, right? So when you push any of these to their extremes, it doesn't lead anywhere, and then they, increasingly it's to the point now where they don't even fight with each other because they don't even talk to each other. So sustainability then, in my view, is sort of how do we harvest the best of each of these underlying isms or philosophies and integrate them, fuse them into a new synthesis that's more than any of them individually. This will be a theme that I return to on a regular basis, which is kind of the creative fusion of things together into something that's more than the sum of the parts. So if we can harvest out kind of the rationalism of capitalism, the naturalism of environmentalism, and the humanism of socialism and combine them together, maybe we're onto something. And sustainable enterprise, in my view, again, is the integration of these things together. So this is the idea of the triple bottom line. But let's get away for a moment from the idea, because I think that this tends to be a path that people go down, and terminology has a lot to do with it, and I'll say more about that. Just the term triple bottom line, which is a great term, or double bottom line. It tends to, because terms can just kind of infect your thinking, right, and can affect the way that you actually then think about taking action. So let's, for a moment, think about this term triple bottom line. If you take it at face value, it tends to lead one to think that there are three separate accounts. You know, that there's the environment, there is the social issues, and there's the economic or the financial aspect. And if you look around in companies today, often that's in fact exactly the way it's organized. You know, there's a bunch of people who are supposed to be responsible for the environment, there's a bunch of people who are supposed to be responsible for social stuff, and then of course there's the real business. Right? Right? So you end up with these, silos, and it's as though these are separate accounts, and then the next step in the flawed logic is that there is a trade-off among them. That if we're going to get more social value, that means you have to make less money. Or if we're going to get better environmental quality, then maybe people have to give up, some stuff. The back of the caves thing again, right? So it's this trade-off way of thinking as though that there's a limit to the total in the three accounts and you have to have trade-offs among them. I don't buy that, even for a minute. And if that's the way it is, then I think we're all in trouble. I think the truth is that these things can become synergistic. They have to, right, in order to get to the idea of a sustainable enterprise. We have to develop new businesses that realize all of these things simultaneously. In fact, I would argue that kind of the industrial model of thinking about strategy was, let's start just with the economic proposition. We'll construct a business model strategy around that. And then the extent to which we have to, because there's pressure or they pass regulations or whatever, we'll backfill in, when it comes to social issues or environment as necessary. So you end up with a total value, volume that looks something like that. And it's driven from the economic side of it, in terms of total value created. But I want to argue that if, for all of us sitting in the room, for anyone for that matter, if we're willing to expand our thinking, and from the very beginning, think about what's going on in the world, right? What are the social, and this is your task, right, for the new initiative. What are the really important driving social problems, social questions? What are the important environmental challenges that we face? And then how do we begin to meld that with an economic model? In other words, to commingle those, to make sure they're rattling around in your brain that way right from the start, and to develop business processes to do that effectively, that we can create businesses that actually create more total value on all three dimensions simultaneously, including the money part, right? So I'm not ready yet to say that a social business is one that doesn't make money for investors. In fact, I think the only way we're going to address the kind of problems that we have out there in the world, the scale and scope of those challenges, the speed of that the transformation is going to have to occur, if you buy into my IPAC analysis, the only way that's going to happen is if we have investment on a massive scale. Now, I'm not saying a few, multi-billion-dollar investments. I'm saying millions of small new ventures, right, and initiatives happening all over the world. From existing incumbent firms, from startup companies, we need millions of new business experiments and investors and ventures. And that means to make this sort of transformation, we're going to need massive amounts of investment capital. And right now, at least, I think the only way that that's going to happen is if there's a return. That's the only way we're going to get the marshaling of the kind of resources that are going to be necessary to create this. As I think even our opening panel said, that if it's just philanthropic or break even, that's great, but if it becomes really successful, then the company probably can't keep doing it because it's going to put the company out of business. So we better have something that's also a good business proposition at the same time. That's my view. Right? So I view sustainable enterprise this way, that it's the possibility, the opportunity to generate more value on all three dimensions simultaneously. Now, that's not easy to do. But just because it's not easy to do doesn't mean that it isn't good strategy. Because a lot of people say, well, why don't we just pass a regulation that all companies do this? Well, stop and think about it for a minute, right? I mean, there's no competitive advantage there. Right? If it's just a standard that's set, there's no competitive advantage. The game here is to use the competitive process to create strategies that are competitively superior and outcompete other ones. That's the game. This strategy, I will argue, will outcompete this one. It has to, right? That's how we will make the transformation to a sustainable world. And yeah, stakeholder kind of notion, creating shared value. I mean, these are ideas that have been rattling around a long time. You know, stakeholder theory goes back to the 80s with Ed Freeman, and of course this is Mike Porter's and Mark Kramer's piece that just appeared in HBR this past year. It's beginning to pick up steam, so we should be excited about that. But what does it really mean? What does it really mean? You know, sustainability is as foreign a concept to managers in capitalist societies as profits are to managers in the former Soviet Union. You know, Ruckelshaus meant that to be funny, but it's not really that funny, but it's true. It's true. So what I want to do next, I'm going to pause for a moment now and see if you have any kind of questions or comments or concerns. But what I'd like to do next is develop this idea of sustainable enterprise and how we drive sustainable value in a more specific way to translate it, make it actionable in business terms. Because all what I've been talking about so far has been more conceptual. Are there any kind of burning questions or issues at this stage of the game that people would like to raise? Plus, it gives everyone a chance to take a breather, including me. I know I'm talking too fast. Sorry. Any questions? Wow, total clarity has been achieved? That's a first. Okay. No, that's fine. So I know that some, are the cards being passed around by the way? Oh, there is a question. Perfect. Please. Oh, are you going to ask it in Portuguese? Will you ask it in English? Because I need to get my earphone if you're going to.
Can try.
And can try in English. Okay, here comes the mic.
Wait.
Ooh, is it on?
Wait.
Here we go. Or not. See, this is a good way to test the microphones. Now they're working. Okay. Good.
My question is about a challenge, I believe, is to talk about these things with the people who are actually not here, but probably would like to be, and those people we're talking about who are also the most affected by this whole capitalist system that will leave them excluded. So I'm talking about also not only the favela guys or the people who live in a poor situation, but also including those guys who are actually from a traditional way of seeing life, just like the black communities or the red Indians communities, and they are all over the world. So I think one of the challenge to talk about all this sustainability stuff is also how to include those people who are actually out of the system since the beginning. So how can we bring them to this speech, you see?
I could not agree more, you know, and I'll actually have something very concrete to say on exactly that question as we move forward. I don't mean to deflect the question, but I'll actually talk specifically about how to go about doing exactly what you've just said, which is engaging the actual base of the pyramid in the process of business co-creation. And then also getting the business people, right, the people in the corporations engaged as well, right? That yeah, you could say that here we're preaching to the converted, but that's pretty important too, right? Because the only way any of this stuff's going to happen is for there to be champions for change and innovation. You know, that can be done either through the starting of new ventures or through entrepreneurial initiatives within existing companies, like what we've heard with Coke, right, and Colectivo and so forth. That's the only way it's going to happen. And the only way that those things happen, is for people to decide that they're going to make them happen, and to be able to make a case for why it makes sense, and to get the financing if you're a startup entrepreneur, and the internal coalition support for internal investment if you're an internal entrepreneur. That's why you guys are so important, right? I mean, the initiative has to come from someone, and then those other parties have to be effectively and productively engaged in the process. So, and I'll talk about both of them. But thank you, it's a really important question. One more, and then we can, oh, go ahead.
And I'm very interested about your book, so might talk later.
Sure, yeah, sure. For sure. We'll do, if there's one more now, we can do that, and then I see a hand over here.
Professor Hart,
Yeah.
I'd like to know, you were talking about Christians that are converted already, and there's a big difference, I believe, between new ventures coming up and being sustainable and having three sides. Whereas you have already the established corporations with centuries of history and huge incomes and that basically define the world's economics right now. I think that a key difference between, as you pointed out, the three different stages of corporations was that in the Industrial Revolution, everything had to be reinvented. Right now, it looks more like 80% of it is already invented. We have the space for the 20% that's left, but we also have to change that 80% that already is established. So how do you go about doing that to the point that it becomes part of the very, very core of existing corporations like GE or Coca-Cola or any other corporations that are huge? Anything that changes about them can wreak havoc in all of society or also be a very positive impact in society.
Yep.
How do you change that to the core of existing corporations, not just new upcoming ventures?
Yeah, I mean, that's a fabulous question. You know what, it's actually also an unbelievable segue into what I was going to talk about next. No, seriously, because that's exactly what I want to talk about is how do we take these ideas and create viable strategies around them that will stick both within existing large corporations, but also just on their own merits, you know, in terms of thinking about new ventures. But what I'll talk about next is exactly that. Let's just take the case of Corporation X for a moment, right? So we'll think about Corporation X. Each of you think about a large incumbent corporation of your choice, and that can be your mental model for what I'm about to talk about, okay? Because I think it's going to come directly to that question. All right? And if it doesn't, then tell me it didn't. So there are all of these buzzwords, you know, swirling around, right? I mentioned a few of them, and my colleague Mark Milstein and I took maybe half an hour or a few years back, and so there are probably new ones that aren't up here. This isn't a comprehensive list. But just look through here, you know, and you'll see some of your, I'm sure, some of your favorites, some that you're comfortable with, you know, kind of feels like a warm bath. And then others you can say, like, what is that? Or what is bizarre, and I have no idea what that means. You know, so like, some people that have told me that one, like, what is P to 4B? I'll get to that. But I think this proliferation of buzzwords is a reflection of what I was saying before, that there are many starting points from which people have come at this space. You know, that first of all, there are some that are more environmental, right? And then there are some that are more social. But even within that, there are subdivisions, you know. There are some people, the environmental people, some of them are more geared toward, well, how do we get, you know, emission reduction in, you know, current, you know, pulp plants. And, you know, others are geared toward a whole new clean technology. The social side, you know, there might be people who are, you know, who are really worried about rural poverty, you know, and then other people where it's really about, you know, industrial democracy, you know, and so there's all of these different starting points, and they typically don't talk to each other very much, and they have different buzzwords, but sometimes they use the same buzzwords, but mean different things. So this actually becomes maddening at some point, because it's hard to carry on a reasonable conversation about this, you know, because I work a lot with big companies, you know, coming back to your question. And I think a lot of the hang-up just comes in not having a common way, you know, kind of a set of ideas and constructs to actually have a conversation about what this actually means. So the result is it's just a sort of chaos, and then eventually people give up and they say, this is just a bunch of crap, you know, let's move on, let's get back to real business. You know, and that happens a lot. So being a strategy guy, as I am, strategy professor, you have to have a 2x2 matrix. right? For those of you that have been in business school, you know that if you take a strategy class and there isn't a 2x2 matrix, that the professor must really not be very good. So I'll perpetrate a 2x2 matrix on you here today. And let's start with just the bare, bald-faced question of what does it take to generate shareholder value on an ongoing basis? In other words, take the social and sustainability aspect of it and set it aside for the moment. What does it take to generate shareholder value on an ongoing basis? And to start with, so if you look at this vertical axis, and this is really simple-minded. So again, like the IPAT formula, I think the beauty of the sustainability space is it's really simple stuff. It's obvious too, right? So as soon as I say it, you'll say, well, that's obvious. That any existing company, coming back to your question, has to, on this vertical axis, you have to manage today's existing business effectively, coming back to your question. But you also have to be building tomorrow's opportunity. And just like the triple bottom line, right, can lead to some flawed thinking that these are separate compartments, sometimes I would say people in companies assume that this is actually chronological, or this is sequential. Okay. First, we'll get today's business right, and then later on, we'll worry about tomorrow's opportunity. It's like first one, then the other. That's almost a certain prescription for going out of business at some point, not in the not too far distant future. What I'm arguing here is we have to do both of these things well all the time. Right? These are, in a sense, competing because they require different logics. Right? But every company has to be doing both all the time, or else it's in deep trouble. So that's number one, and there's this sort of tension there. On this axis, it's kind of where does stuff happen. So on the left-hand side, it's necessary for any company, any existing enterprise, to build and nurture a set of existing internal capabilities. Right? That when you think about it, a business is really a collection of routines that the company knows how to execute. And that the way that you become a really efficient operator is just to get damn good at those through repetition and continuous improvement. And if you can't do that, you're probably not a very good company. But that if you only do that and you wall yourself off from what's going on, and the right-hand side is about what's happening out in the world. Right? If you wall yourself off from that, you might get really good at doing a set of routines, but the routines might be either totally or at least increasingly irrelevant, or even worse, they might be at odds with where the world is going. So the company has to be both very conscious about building internal skills and capabilities and making sure that the company can execute them. But at the same time also has to be always focused on engaging voices, points of view that come from the outside, kind of the external constituency. We'll think of them as stakeholders. Has to be worried about the integration of stakeholder views. And again, there's a tension there. Yeah? And then if you kind of fill in these four quadrants, what does that mean from the standpoint of performance or driving shareholder value? Well, in today's business, if you look in terms of the management of internal facilities and operations, we got to drive down cost and reduce risk. That's kind of obvious, right? I mean, quarterly earnings, right? That we all know that that's important to driving shareholder value. But it's not the only thing, even in today's business, because if we forget about the external side of things, then we know that companies can get their proverbial heads handed to them. Like, ask our friends at, Enron or WorldCom or a variety of other companies who aren't creating a lot of shareholder value these days. Even though they were really good in the lower left for a while, right? They kind of lost touch with what was going on out there in the world. So, engaging external constituencies is critical to building reputation, building legitimacy, maybe creating a differentiated position so that people in the world view you as important. Maybe even love you, right, at the extreme. Seriously, right? I think that emotional ties to companies is really underrated, and not really very many have them, right? I think most companies view their existence in purely kind of money in transactional terms or a exchange for service. But some of the most enduring companies and some of the most enduring brands, there's a love relationship there. We were having this discussion about Coke, right? And that there's a love relationship there. Are there any companies that you love that you would just hate to see if they disappeared? You know, it would be like you lost somebody you love. Patagonia. Yeah. Are there others? Apple. Yep. Hear that one a lot. But it's true, isn't it? It's true. But you notice we don't hear a whole lot of company names being thrown around right now. And I think it's because companies have really underinvested in that lower right quadrant. You know, I think that actually turns out to be a really important potential value driver that we haven't done nearly enough with. And comparatively spent too much time worrying about the lower left, as though that's everything. But even these two aren't nearly enough, because this is only about the current business. Coming right back to your question again, that we know that companies also have to be building tomorrow's opportunity. And to do that, you have to be constantly building new skills and repositioning and new capabilities inside the company in order to be ready to move on what's going to come next. And you can't wait, or else it's too late. So certainly R&D, but also tying up with partners and NGOs, alliances, and so forth to get you out into new space that you hadn't really thought about before, that's going to take you into new territory, is a really important element in terms of building up new skills and capabilities to position you for the future. But again, that's important, but if all you do is build up that skill inside the company and you don't really know what to do with it, it doesn't get you that far. So also having a clear idea of where does the future lie, right? What's the growth path and trajectory for the company is really important. And I found, at least if you, and this is a very simple-minded framework, some of you are probably familiar with the balanced scorecard concept. This is basically the simple version of the balanced scorecard concept. But if you take this and apply it to companies, you'll find that often they don't pass the test. You can certainly find companies that are really lower left-centric, but even ones that do a good job in the lower right or even the upper left, sometimes they forget the upper right, and their stock price is still flat. Right? They don't have a compelling vision and story of how they're going to grow the company, even though they're doing all this great R&D. They've got all this technology, but they don't know what to do with it. There are lots of companies like that. So you have to do all four of these things well all of the time in order to continuously generate shareholder value. Does that make sense? It's pretty simple. Now doing it's a different thing. So now let's bring in the sustainability angle. You remember all those buzzwords? So now we'll take those buzzwords and we'll do a buzzword sort. We'll take them and we'll try to divide them into the quadrants where they belong. And then hopefully that begins to impose some order on what would otherwise be this kind of blooming present confusion of all these buzzwords. So the first one's here. Take a look at this set. Greening, emission reduction, eco-efficiency, ISO 14000, waste reduction. So do we have any manufacturing plant people in the room here? Probably not so much. Well, this is your world, right? Right? So this is all about facility management, right? How do we reduce waste? We've got raw materials coming in. How do we minimize the cost of that by driving as much raw material into product as we possibly can so we don't create waste, driving down the energy use. So this is all about continuous improvement, reducing waste, using resources more productively. This is what really put the environmental sustainability and business thing on the map. So I call this pollution prevention. And it's a powerful strategy, and we shouldn't underestimate or minimize it for a moment. But it is what it is, right? And it can never be more than that. And so for a lot of incumbent companies, this has been an important starting point because it's helped really drive down cost and risk in their current core businesses and make them more competitive. That's a good thing, right? That's a good thing, and it's a way to begin to get the sustainability agenda on, on the radar screen and to show that it has business relevance. Now, this has been going on now for 20 years plus, right? So I think it's pretty well established in most large corporations. Although there's still a huge agenda here for SMEs, right? For small and medium-sized firms, that many of which haven't even begun on this path. So just right there's a life's work, right, when it comes to SMEs. But then you move over here and you see a collection of buzzwords. Take a look at these, like life cycle management. You guys know what that is, right? I mean, again, these are all buzzwords. So this is life cycle management is the idea that unlike pollution prevention, where you're just looking internally, right? You're just looking at the current company operations and facilities. Life cycle management is over on the external side, so now we're going to look, whatever the company is, all the way upstream, even if you're a service company, all the way upstream. Where do the raw materials and energy and so forth that you use come from, and what are the impacts associated with that? All the way up to the communities, right? It's kind of up the supply chain. And then all the way downstream. What happens to the products and services in use? What are they used for? What happens if it's actually an artifact? What happens to that at the end of its useful life? Does it just go to the landfill? That's all the way downstream. So that's the full life cycle. And then if we're going to be effective at that, we had better engage people, voices up and down that whole chain in helping us figure out how to continuously improve what we're doing. That's the idea of stakeholder management or stakeholder engagement or green design or design for environment. Right? This is thinking about the whole life cycle of the product system and then taking decisive action to change the design to reduce that whole life cycle impact. This is becoming more and more, kind of broadly used. You think about what Walmart has been doing, right? Now they're at one end, right? They're retailing, but they've basically they've established a set of demands about what they expect a product to look like if they're going to sell, and place the onus on the product producers to say, we're not going to buy from you unless you can demonstrate that what your product passes muster when it comes to what I would call product stewardship. All right, so that's kind of an extreme version of that, out on, now all the way down on the retailing end. Manufacturers that are actually making products have the ability to fundamentally alter their design, right, so that they could take back, they could reuse, they could remanufacture, right? There are a whole set of ways to reduce these sort of life cycle impacts and to engage the voices up and downstream to help them do that. So more and more companies are headed down this path. It clearly has contributed to legitimacy and reputation, but there's also a trap as well when you think about this, because just like there were early versions of pollution prevention, there was the early version of product stewardship, which really started happening in the 90s, was the whole idea of green products. Right? Because that's a buzzword. I didn't put it in this one because it actually has, I think now today, an increasingly negative connotation. Let's find bias things. What do you think of when you hear the term green products? What first comes to mind? Be honest. Marketing. Which is probably meant not in a positive way. Right? What else? Green products, what comes to mind? Recycling. Yep, absolutely. Recycling. Marketing, recycling. Efficiency. I heard another one. Walmart bags. Renewable resources. Yeah. Anything else? Expensive. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Organic. Yeah. Yeah. So it's usually some combination of, it's got recycled stuff in it, it's organic, so that's the greeny part, right? But it's probably going to be more expensive, and maybe it doesn't work as well either, maybe it's not so proven, but I'm going to buy it because I want to be a good citizen, right? I mean, isn't that this kind of the green product story? And I still remember how one of the first products back in the 90s that took this sort of green product approach was toilet paper. back then, you know. Green toilet paper. And no, I still remember I suckered for it, you know, and I bought this stuff and took it home, and immediately I knew it didn't work as well. And it was more expensive, but you know, it had lots of pictures of trees and it had recycled content, right? So to me, this was like one of the really negative, I shouldn't say that, it was like one of the first attempts, but if that's what product stewardship or green products or green design is, then it doesn't work, right? That's not what it's about, right? Anyone, when you think about it, anyone can do that. How much skill does it take just to load some, you know, to get a boatload of recycled stuff and dump it into your product, even though it makes it worse, and then try to charge a premium price for it because it's green. Like, anybody can do that. And it's never achieved more than a relatively small niche market, you know, those kind of products. The challenge is actually how do you improve the product through this kind of design? How do you make something that has either the same or even better functionality at the same or lower cost? That's the trick. Or something that just changes the game. You know, that you think about organic food, right, these days is more expensive, but it's viewed as a different category than conventional, right? So people will see a value proposition, you know, it's gaining share all the time. So that's the difference in my view. Product stewardship, you have to think of it in competitive terms, not just as a PR ploy. That's where the marketing thing came in. But even that doesn't get us there. I think this is helpful around kind of today's business. But what about the upper part of the model? You know, coming right back to your question again. Because this is where I think the rubber meets the road with your question. Take a look at these. Eco-effectiveness. Have you heard that term? Eco-effectiveness? No? This is, you know, Bill McDonough? Is that a familiar name? See, this is part of it, because this is a social business group, right? So he's more of an environmental guy. You know, we need to talk to each other more. So Bill McDonough has coined this term eco-effectiveness as opposed to just eco-efficiency. Because think about eco-efficiency, that's about reducing incrementally the negative impact of a current process, right? And product stewardship is about reducing incrementally the negative impact of a current product. But when you get up above the line here, and you're talking about this upper left quadrant, you're talking about leapfrogging to something that starts from its very beginning as inherently clean. It's not, as Bill McDonough would say, it's not less bad, it's more good. Right? That's an important distinction to make. You know, thinking about biomimicry, you know, how do we mimic nature's process? That's a whole field now, a whole design field called biomimicry. It's about leapfrogging, right, to what comes next. Thinking about sustainable technology, cradle to cradle, right, where things literally come completely back, and it's a continuous reuse, not just recycling content, you know, that ends up in the landfill, but continuous reuse. Restorative technology, where literally you're engaged in a new approach that actually enhances and improves some underlying natural system and maybe human system, not just reducing the negative impact. So what might a couple of examples of this be? Well, I'll give you an example that's maybe in everyday life. How many people dry clean their clothes? One. Actually, that's good. I'm pleased. But you know about dry cleaning, right? Do you know what the active chemical is in dry cleaning? It's one of those long, nasty names called perchloroethylene. Perc. It's a really nasty, toxic thing. So if you're, sir, dry cleaning your clothes, you're wearing a lot of nasty, toxic residue around with you all the time. And for the people that work at the dry cleaner, it's not such a great place to work. You know, there's exposure to this stuff. It degrades the fabric. That's why you get all this lint, you know, if you dry clean your clothes. So if you think about you ever wonder, probably not because nobody dry cleans, but would you in theory ever wonder why dry cleaning hasn't concentrated as an industry? Because it hasn't anywhere in the world, right? It's all still a mom and pop kind of operation everywhere, including the United States, where, you know, you'd think if it was going to get concentrated, it would. But it hasn't. part of the reason is that every little mom and pop dry cleaner is a toxic site. And no corporation wants to own hundreds and hundreds of toxic sites if they don't already. So it hasn't concentrated as a result. Now, what's happened is there are some new approaches to dry cleaning that have come forward over the last decade. One, which uses liquid carbon dioxide. Now, this is not a greenhouse gas problem. I mean, this is taking carbon dioxide just like you would to carbonate soda, right? Like a Coke. You put it under pressure, it turns to a liquid, and this company called Micelle Technologies has developed a whole suite of soaps that work really well in liquid carbon dioxide under pressure. And so you could, in theory, make computer chips completely in liquid carbon dioxide, eliminate totally the use of water, and eliminate toxics 100%. And it would be a closed system. They're working on that. But the most immediate application has been in dry cleaning, where they've designed a washing machine that uses liquid carbon dioxide. You put the clothes in, put it under pressure, put the CO2 under pressure, turns to liquid, wash the clothes, take the pressure off, the CO2 just evaporates on its own. You don't have to use any energy to actually dry the clothes. It's completely non-toxic, it doesn't degrade the fabrics, you take it out, it smells good, and it comes in at a price point comparable to conventional dry cleaning. It's a safe and healthy place to work, it's more sophisticated technology. Which would you rather do? I would predict that within a decade, the old PERC-based dry cleaning is served market. And so as a result, it may actually struggle to come into commercial reality because incumbents may really resist it, especially powerful ones. Which is why the dry cleaning example is instructive. There are no big incumbents, which is why that, the entrepreneurs will probably creatively destroy that one fairly quickly. There are no large incumbents because the industry hasn't concentrated because nobody wants to own all the toxic sites, right? But that's not true in most other industries where you might have powerful incumbent firms that have a lot of hard asset in the ground and don't want to give up on it quickly. So many of the emerging clean technologies struggle to come into commercial reality as a result. Which is why, I would argue, it becomes interesting and important to begin to think about the upper right here. Wow. Take a look at this one. Sustainable development, pro-poor business. This is kind of more now getting into the social business movements, right? Urban reinvestment, brownfield redevelopment, community capitalism, civic entrepreneurship. I would put social business in there. B to 4B, business to 4 billion. Radical transactiveness. Now, there's a real buzzword, and I'll have to take some responsibility for that one. I'll explain what that means in a few minutes. So what is this about, right? This is about, unlike product stewardship, which is about the incremental improvement of products in current served markets, this upper right space is about the people and places that have been ignored, exploited, or forgotten. The people or places that have been ignored, exploited, or forgotten. Which is unfortunately the majority of humanity, right? And many places from the standpoint of the traditional capitalist model. So this is what I would call the base of the pyramid. This is where the big growth opportunity lies. There's no question. So since this is the group that it is, I'm not going to take the time to explain, how the counterintuitive thinking that produced the drummy bank came about, because you already know that, and actually move on, because I think it's important to kind of develop this. Because what I want to do is take these upper two quadrants, which come to your original question about how do corporations engage this question, and really double clicks on those. Because the truth is, if you were to take this, I think of this as a portfolio. And so your corporation X that you have in mind, for any corporation, you can actually chart the portfolio for that company. Think about, exhaustively, if you can, what are the initiatives and activities and human resources and, investment capital in all four of these. Go through and actually do an inventory of what's going on, and then chart it up here. And you would have the sustainable value portfolio for that company. If you did that for Corporation X, which is in your mind, I think you would find, here's the portfolio, that the typical company has a pretty bottom-heavy portfolio. And usually it's even more bottom left. You know? There's comparatively less in the upper part of this portfolio. And then, you know, if you're sort of serious about examining this for Corporation X, you'd have to ask the question, is that the portfolio you want to have for the next 5 years? And if the answer is yes, then you say, okay, I'm moving on to the next company. But typically, if you engage people from Corporation X in this question, you know, go through this process and ask that question, they'll say, no, that's probably not a very good portfolio for us to have, you know, looking out over the next 5 years. In fact, we could end up getting the proverbial 2x4 in the back of the head, you know, because we're not going to be positioned for what's going to be coming. So we'd better get some investments in the upper part, right? We'd better get some stuff going up in here. That's how I try to, if I'm dealing with an existing large corporation, that to me becomes the strategic logic for how you think about this. We better get some new initiatives going, some intrapreneurs, you know, some new ventures that are going to help us move the portfolio, not abandon the lower part, but expand it up into the upper part of this. But that's going to require some new skills and capabilities. You know, whereas down here, we can build on existing skills because it's continuous improvement. Companies already know how to do, you know, continuous improvement-based thing, you know, sort of the Six Sigma black belt way of thinking. But companies maybe don't have so many of the skills to do this immediately. It's going to require a new form of martial art, right, if you're going to really get after this. And so that's what I would like to talk about last. And so let me again pause there and see if there are any burning, you know, questions and so forth. And then I have one last segment that, yeah, and then it'll still leave time for us to process on some of the, you know, cards and questions from the audience. Any burning issues on that one? You know, as a way of taking the broad idea of sustainable enterprise now and creating more of a kind of a business case for how you sell it, because that's pretty essential. I see a hand right here. By the way, did I answer your question? Good, thank you. Oh, hello. Yeah.
Hello. I was wondering about the actual economic model that we have in the world, and I don't see these new business they actually being the same model that we have today. So I don't know if it's possible or if it's needed to change the way that we think about economics in order to make this change.
So I want to make sure I understand your question. So are you saying with the question that this, well, I'd have to scroll all the way back to the what drives shareholder value part of it, you know, which was cost and risk and reputation and legitimacy, new skills and capabilities, and growth path and trajectory. That you don't think that that is a reasonable representation for what a company, in the current model, what the company would have to do in order to drive value?
Yeah, I think that in the current model that we have, it seems to me that only thinking in this, if you're thinking the old way for this bottom of this graph, I think that this is the way that people are generating value today.
Which means the lower part.
Yeah.
I wouldn't disagree with that. But then I guess my response would be, well, as a company then, you're probably operating with a strategy that's going to get you dead. Right? I mean, that's the truth. And it's already happening. Right? That if you look at the rate of creative destruction in the economy, I can put some statistics up, which I don't have with me, but the lifespan of the typical corporation where that company operates under that name and current governance structure has been steadily declining over the last 70 or 80 years. You know, like if you go back to the 1920s, corporations, their average life was 70 or 80 years under that name in that current form. Today it's closer to 10. You know, so that companies get broken up, they demerge, they get bought out, you know, there's M&A, you know, that very few large companies just outright fail, right? But for whatever reason, you know, their strategy has proven to be not viable, and they cease to exist in their current form. And I would argue, at least in part, it's because they've tended to be more bottom heavy. They haven't really figured out how to keep, you have to kind of keep going after what's going to come next. Or else at the end of the day, you start running the assets into the ground. And that's when you get vultures start hovering over the top of you, because they see undervalued assets. So I think it's part and parcel. That's why actually in a strange way, the challenge of sustainability I believe, can get companies to think more creatively about things that are going to just be for their own good, just in a purely financial point of view, and from the standpoint of staying alive, for the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years. Other questions? Yes, sir.
I have the mic here. I don't know if I should go ahead.
Where am I? Raise hand. Here. Okay. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Rachel. I live in Sao Paulo.
Yep.
As you're probably aware, next year Brazil will host the United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development,
Indeed.
Rio +20,
Yep.
on green economy.
I was in Rio, by the way. Yeah.
And this will be a great opportunity to discuss all of the issues that you're raising here today. I'm part of a group that is putting together a forum on social entrepreneurship and sustainability for Rio +20. And I would like to ask you, what do you think should be the core of the agenda of this meeting? Since it is an international meeting, and hopefully we will be able to bring all the issues that are being discussed here at the Choice Conference. This is a great platform and for the world to pay attention to the issues we're discussing here. So what would you include there as the core of the agenda? And second, who would you invite for such a meeting? Would it be, hubs of hubs that should gather, or are we talking about bringing the real people who are doing the real work in terms of social entrepreneurship, on a day-to-day basis? Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, sure. And I think you could probably anticipate my answer, right? I think that what we're talking about here today probably should be the centerpiece. And even if I think about what happened in the first Rio and what came out of it, and then I was also at Rio +10 in Johannesburg, what happened there and what came out of it. What didn't happen so much, yes, there were lots of declarations, and lots of, kind of long documents that were issued, but almost none of it ever got put into effect, right? So in other words, the stuff that was more governmental, where, we were going to adopt these new charters and so forth, nothing much ever really came of it. There was a lot of paper produced, but nothing much ever really came of it. I think that was true in Rio +10 as well. It probably would be true again. It's the same story if you look at Copenhagen, with the climate change stuff. There's a lot of heat and no light, and then nothing happens. It's really tough to get that many governments to try to agree to do anything. It's like least common denominator. So if I see what really came out that was productive out of the first Earth Summit, it really was, this is my completely biased view, it was the creation of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development and the issuance of the very first Changing Course book by Stefan Schneidheim and his compatriots, which produced the whole wave of eco-efficiency and legitimated this stuff in the business world for the first time. The first Rio really was a huge step forward in making that happen. And that actually had major material positive effects out there in the world. And so I think that was the one big payoff that came out of the first Rio meeting. And it was driven more on the commercial side, right? I don't think things have changed. In fact, I think it's gotten even more pressing that we think about where the real leverage points are. And I think the real leverage points are in the enterprise sector. I'm happy to talk with you offline, about ideas for that and, people and so forth. But that's my totally biased view.
Professor?
Yes.
Yes, I would like to issue the generation shock, if I can address that way. I believe that how can you convince baby boomer, for example,
You mean like me?
yes, multi-millionaire investor, because you have to understand that those people are also a very important part in the puzzle that is going to become the business world in the future. those people, they are a very important part in that process. And how can you convince that person? Because when you are an entrepreneur on the social side, I don't see how the profits are as big as the dirty capitalism way of being, because the profits are maximum. When you only care about the economical part, maybe you can be dead in some years because you don't see the future coming, but they do got profits, they do get profits, and they did get a lot of profits only looking at the economical side, the financial side. And how can you convince that people, those people, like, not to get so much profit out of it, because they are going to profit less when they invest firstly, of course, when they invest in social entrepreneurships. And
so we're coming back, I think, to the core thesis that I presented early on, the idea that it's possible to actually generate a competitively superior strategy that can actually produce better outcomes on all three dimensions, including the financial dimension. In other words, not less profit. Now, coming back to your question, which I think you raise a really important issue, which is that it has always been true, well, not always, but at least for the last couple hundred years that we've had this, kind of the industrial model in place. And even before then, too, right? I mean, where there has been the freedom to undertake, these kinds of economic activities and ventures, there have always been what I would call hit and run players, right? Players who are out to make the money as fast as they can, and they're not in it for the long game. So that, by definition, that's the antithesis of somebody motivated to be a sustainable enterprise. The great thing about capitalism, from my point of view, is that there's no central director, right? That it allows this sort of yeasty, kind of entrepreneurial experimentation. And the worst thing about capitalism is that there's no central director. Because players like that actually exist. But I guess so my answer to your question is, I really believe that part of this transformation that we see happening is that it's going to make it more and more and more difficult for those kind of players to stay alive for very long. Because they get exposed a lot faster, right? Especially with the explosion of information technology. It becomes more and more difficult to hide, especially if you have explosive, profiteering success in the short term. That's going to attract attention, and it's going to become more and more difficult to keep that going for very long. And eventually, you're going to get disciplined out of the system because somebody's going to come along that has a better model, right? And so if you look at, I suppose, if you look at it from the sustainable enterprise version of discounted cash flows, the player that's adopting the triple bottom line mentality is going to, over the longer term, is going to have more payoff than the hit and run player will. I really believe that that's the case. And we actually have a little bit of a living case of that even in our own territory with microfinance, right? If you look at microfinance as an industry, you begin to see some serious questions being raised about, is there profiteering happening in microfinance? With some bright lights being shined on some specific players. Yeah? Would you agree?
Yeah.
And that's provoked a real conversation even in the microfinance industry. And I would argue that everyone in the microfinance industry now is thinking about that, maybe in a different way than they did even a couple of years ago. And I think that's going to happen in every industry, on steroids in the coming years.
it's just because I don't really see how can a mining company can become a social business, or how can an oil extraction, nothing against it, because we have to use it somehow.
Well, so if you buy into this framework, I'm arguing that some industries are simply going to go away. That's it. That's the idea of getting to the upper part of the model. That you can only some industries lend themselves only to pollution prevention and product stewardship. But by their inherent nature, they're unsustainable, either environmentally or socially, and they're going to have to go away. So I come back to what I said right at the beginning. There's some of these pathways that are going to be foreclosed to us because they lead to oblivion. And so that's simply going to become increasingly clear. And the question becomes, which companies that are in those industries now will make the transition to something else and survive? Because a lot of them just, frankly, won't. But to me, that's part of the transition to sustainability. Last question, please. And then I'll keep going. I have one more little segment, and then we'll take one.
Okay, I'll be really fast. Okay,
Yeah.
so as we were talking about capitalism and being enterprises, the biggest symbol of capitalism, and you are also talking about legitimacy. And I was wondering, because obviously most of the enterprises are on the below line. Okay, so it will be something kind of funny, but sometimes they have green products, they have something that is not related to its core business, and it's just marketing. It's not real. And I was wondering, okay, so we have the upper line, and there are a bunch of things that are necessary to do. And what are the companies other than Coca-Cola and Natura, I guess, there are some, what are the companies doing or what is real to make them legit and not just phony? What is required? It has to be related to its core business, meaning its product, it has to be non-polluted, it has to promote social inclusion. What is required, actually?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've just articulated what probably some of the important criteria that I would say to be in this space. It means that you're serious about creating a new business. You know, that you don't see it just as a marketing tool or as corporate social responsibility, which is largely philanthropic. You see it as a business opportunity, and the company is willing to make an investment in starting a new business, just like they would make an investment to expand an existing one, right? or a geographic expansion, you know, of a current product or something like that. That it's viewed as an investment for the company, right? And there's this, and you're serious about trying to create it as a business that has the potential to grow and profit, and ultimately perhaps become one of the core businesses, and perhaps even make one of the current businesses obsolete. That's how I would think about this management of this portfolio. We need to be creating the options on the future. That's what the upper part of the model is all about. And we need more, we need as many options, we need as many lifeboats as we can possibly get our hands on, because when the time comes, and the time is coming, we're going to need to get giant billows out, you know, and put wind behind the sails of the new models that we're generating here, that all of you are going to be generating. Because the truth is that the government can't figure out what to do. Governments can't create this stuff. They just can't. And that's not meant as a criticism. It's really not their job to do that. It's our job as entrepreneurs to create the new models, to create the new businesses, to create the lifeboats. What the government can do when the time comes is actually figure out how to create policies that create the giant billows that make them go faster. But if there aren't the models out there to blow behind, then we're stuck. Right? So it's incumbent on all of us, both as entrepreneurs and intrapreneurs in existing companies, to generate those models. That's the upper part of this. And now companies themselves have the capacity to get out their own billows, and that to me is when you know you've got a lifeline. Okay? Last segment here, then we can have more questions. Because it really comes, you know, again, I'm showing my clear bias here. I'm with Tom Friedman on this one. I think we've arrived at the time of the Great Disruption when both Mother Nature and Father Greed hit the wall at the same time. We're there, you know, we're there. That some of you have probably seen this funnel metaphor before, but I think it's apt. It's good. That on one wall of the funnel, we have the growing environmental issues. And I won't go over them again, we've already talked about it, but it's sort of like a narrowing funnel, like the problems globally of pollution, depletion, degradation, and so forth. The other side of that funnel, of course, are the problems of population, poverty, inequity, and so forth. And we won't go over those again. Everybody in the room, I think, has a clear understanding of what those look like and how they're mounting. You know, if we think back to the IPAT, I equals PAT formula that we talked about at the beginning. And so what's happening, I believe, and this is the spirit of the responses that I just gave, you know, to the last couple of questions, is that we see the strategies from the industrial age. You know, the old strategies are starting to crash into the sides of the funnel. We're seeing that happen now with greater regularity. There's more and more crashing into the side of the funnel. They're crashing and burning, increasingly. And the challenge then for us is how do we create the strategies that can make it through the neck of this funnel and come out the other side? Those are the strategies and the businesses, in my view, that are going to thrive in the 21st century, and that's where the iconic companies for the coming century will come from. And there's no reason to apologize that they'll make money too. There's nothing inherently wrong with making a profit. There's nothing wrong with profit. Profit can be good. I'm with Milton Friedman there, right? Profit can be good. The question is, how do you make the profit? And what do you use it for? That's the real question. So I think that's what we need to do, is figure out how we come out the other side of this funnel, and that's going to require strategy, innovation, and entrepreneurship on a scale that we can't imagine today. Now we have some early kind of attempts at that should give us real hope. So we just talked about clean tech, and if we do our job, right, we got now billions of dollars of venture money and private equity going into this. And that should give us hope, but not so much coming out the other end, right? A lot of money going in, but not so much coming out the other end. And then down here, we see social business, social entrepreneurship, base of the pyramid, microfinance. This is really exciting too, when you think about the poverty and inequity. In other words, maybe we can get beyond just aid and philanthropy, just like maybe we can get beyond regulation as the way of addressing the environmental problem. Because neither of those approaches has really worked. So we have clean tech and we have base of the pyramid as really hopeful new strategies. But having said that, it's not enough. Right? That by 2020, more than 3/4 of the S&P 500 will consist of companies that we don't yet know today. There's going to be some real creative disruption in the coming years. But what's happened now, we have clean tech and base of the pyramid, and as important as they are, and as I said a little bit earlier, whenever we have a new innovation, you both solve problems, but you also create new ones. So we have a new set of challenges with these two. And I believe the new set of challenges look something like this, that in the clean tech space, well, first of all, that these are now like two separate communities, and they don't talk to each other. Like, I'll bet there's almost no clean tech person in the audience here. Right? It's like a different, completely different group, and they're walled off from each other. Two communities. If you remember C.P. Snow's book called The Two Cultures, I think, the clean tech and base of the pyramid schism is an example of that. Because the clean techies tend to be very techy, right? So if this was going to be a clean tech group, you'd be mostly engineers, and scientists, and working real hard on developing the next generation of solar or small wind or biofuels or point-of-use water treatment or what have you. And very strongly environmentally focused, but not very focused on how we creatively commercialize this stuff in order to make it stick out there in the world, which is one of the reasons why there's a lot of input, as far as venture capital and private equity money, but still not much output. We don't see rapid uptake or scale out of clean technology. We just don't yet, and boy, we need it. But then let's think about our world, the world that, and we'll call it base of the pyramid, we could call it social business. Again, the labels don't matter. The base of the pyramid social business world is composed of people who are really worried about poverty, right, and inequity. And that's good, just like being worried about the environment is good. And there's a real focus on business model innovation. Right? How do we get more inclusive supply chains? How do we get extended reach out into the rural areas and into the slums? How do we create more inclusive business models that are going to create uplift? All really, really important, really important. But there's also a tendency sometimes to assume that if we just generate all of this new economic activity among those who have previously been excluded, that will somehow create an environmentally sustainable form of development. And we know it won't. We know it could take us all over the cliff. We talked about that at the beginning. So as I see it, the challenge and the opportunity is how do we converge these two? Right? How do we begin to bring these worlds together? I think of that as the green leap, that we need to be thinking about how we take the green leap. And to do that means that we ourselves have to be a little more inclusive in how we think about things. Because not just about the technology, right? It's not just about more R&D. We're swimming in technology already. I mean, there are thousands and thousands of clean technology patents sitting on shelves at universities and corporations doing nothing, right? Literally, right? I've actually done some work on this. What's missing is the imagination for how you take these kinds of technologies and adapt and apply and embed and create opportunities that include actual people in underserved communities. There's a tendency to think that clean tech is just for the rich. Comes back to the green product example, right? Well, green product, that's the premium price thing. It's just for solar. That's for like rich Germans, you know, Californians, right? I mean, that tends to be our bias. But the truth is that a lot of these next generation clean technologies, the best chance that they have to really take off first is at the bottom of the pyramid, right? That's the idea of merging clean technology and base of the pyramid. So if we take the example of solar for a moment, you think about how most Western solar companies played it. Well, they've tended to develop high-cost rooftop solar systems for rich Germans and Californians, right? I mean, that's tended to be the approach. Premium price, niche market, limited scaling, you know, you kind of come down the pyramid from the top down, you reach a hard stopping point beyond which it's just not going to fly because people don't have the money. And even with government incentives, maybe it inches down a little bit, but you're never going to shift the mass market that way, which is what we absolutely need to do. So maybe we need to begin to think, you know, kind of turn the telescope the other way, kind of shift it upside down. How do we, and this is a piece that I wrote with Clay Christensen going back now a decade called Driving Innovation from the Base of the Pyramid. How do we take a leap to the base of the pyramid with a lot of these green technologies? Start there, and then begin to trickle them up. You know, this is the kind of the idea that's emerged now around reverse innovation. That in fact, the conditions that exist in rural areas and slums can be an innovation driver and can allow kinds of things that have languished at the top of the pyramid because it's already well served. It's a protected space because you have incumbents, you know, that have stacked the deck in their favor, where you have rules and regulations that make it difficult to bring in new ways of doing things. You know, the building codes prevent it and this and that. But if you take a leap to the base of the pyramid, it's possible to start fresh, and then you don't have a lot of these built-in perverse incentives and negative biases and so forth. So if we stick with our example, let's say, of solar for a minute, doing a bunch of work in China and India as well, and so I'll talk about one Chinese company in the interest of time right now, Huamin Solar, which is quite interesting. This is a company that started as a technology company. You know, they were focused on developing solar hot water systems using vacuum tubes. So that's what it looks like. If you've been to China, when you get outside of the cities, out in the towns and rural areas, you see these things everywhere, everywhere. Right? And this is a new technology. It's, as I say, you can see it's glass vacuum tubes with a medium in it. The sun hits those, it heats it up, and then it's sticking into a water tank and it heats the water. It's pretty simple. Pretty effective, pretty low cost, less than half the cost of flat panel solar. And initially, they thought, this is Tsinghua Solar, another company. Initially, they thought that this is a green product, so let's sell it to the kind of the rich people in Shanghai and Beijing. After about 3 or 4 years of trying to do that, they gave up because they just weren't getting traction. They realized the early market was in the underserved space, where people did not have dependable access to natural gas or electricity and didn't have hot water most of the time. This industry has exploded. In the last 10 years, it's gone basically from zero to a $10 billion industry in China. The two leaders are Tsinghua Solar and Huamin Solar. There are dozens of other knockoff players, and they're on the verge of going global. Right? In other words, it'll scale out to other developing countries, and then it'll trickle up, because it's a very effective, low-cost way of heating your water, right? And so you could easily imagine, with some added bells and whistles and features, this could travel to the top of the pyramid in the United States, if it can outcompete the way Americans heat their water now. But I come back to what I talked about earlier. It's got to compete. You know, it can't just be some guilt trip thing. It's got to be about low cost and service and effectiveness that would cause somebody to do this and get rid of their existing, you know, hot water heater. But I think that's going to happen. That's the whole idea of creative destruction. And that's the trickle-up idea. This is how we get to leapfrog technology lifting the base of the pyramid because these businesses all employ large numbers of people out in the rural areas and in the towns. And then incubating tomorrow's industries there first and then trickling them up. Like that's the reverse innovation driver. You look at other Indian companies like Tata, you know, the Tata Group, which has created a low-cost in-home drinking water purifier, a nano home. You may have seen that just announced. The Tatas have come out now with a $600 home. $600 home, that's a new commercial enterprise they've just launched. Of course, the Tata Nano car, right? Everyone's heard of that. The $2,000 car, which will go to an electric Nano and then a compressed air Nano next year, and then begin coming up market to the United States. This is the disruptive cycle, right, that I'm talking about that converges clean technology and base of the pyramid. The Tata Nano case is interesting also because not only is it, you know, the existing two-cylinder Nano gets 60 miles to the gallon, it'll go electric next year, but it also has an innovative business model where it's not assembly plant based, where it's so simple, there's only 200 some parts. It's assembled as a kit, so a micro-entrepreneur can be the assembler, seller, and servicer. You get rid of the need for the capital investment in assembly plants and a dealer network. Drop the cost dramatically. And it's a way to bring mobility, sustainable mobility to many, many more people, and then trickle it up market. There are lots of examples that we could talk about around this kind of approach, which I think is enormously important. And, you know, try to turbocharge this to the extent possible. We held an event a couple of years back, you know, called the Cornell Global Forum on Sustainable Enterprise, the Great Convergence. You know, we had some players there that you'll recognize, not by far the least important, but you'll notice next to me is Al Gore, and this is Fitz Johnson, who's the chairman and CEO of SC Johnson, and that's Rod and Tata there, you know, the chairman of the Tata Group, who I just mentioned. And for the real American aficionados, you'll recognize Charlie Rose, who's one of the more skillful TV interviewers. And we had an hour-and-a-half long dialogue about exactly this topic at the 92nd Street Y, very well-known venue in Manhattan. And the Clinton Global Initiative has now made this a part of their core platform, this kind of approach. I was one of the organizers 2 years back of this Harnessing Innovation for Development, good mugshot picture. You know. Somehow Clinton never changes, you know. So when Prahalad and I wrote this piece now going on 10 years ago that the aspiring poor present a prodigious opportunity for the world's wealthiest companies, but it requires a radical new approach to business strategy. Well, I don't think either of us realized how right we were, you know. And it's tragic that he passed away this past year very prematurely before he lived to see a lot of this stuff come to fruition, but I think it is, and it's going to. So I want to just close with a couple of last observations that maybe will help you in thinking about the initiatives that you're going to undertake. Because the truth is, as I said before, any new initiative, you know, no good deed goes unpunished, and any new initiative also creates unintended consequences. So you take a look at this. This is some of the blowback now that the bottom of the pyramid stuff is beginning to get. You know, that profiting from the bottom of the pyramid is gaining momentum. Oh, I see these guys. Oh, someone looks like somebody told them they can find money at the bottom of the pyramid. So the very title of the article, you know, we talked about how triple bottom line kind of caused people to impose an interpretation. Well, so the whole idea that the title of the article, which incidentally was not our title, the editor came up with this title, Fortune at the Bottom of the Pyramid. But that has caused some people to see this as just an extractive, you know, these guys just want to go get what little money the poor have, you know, get the bag of money at the bottom of the pyramid and run away with it. That was never the intent, but the fact that there are some hit-and-run players doing that should give us all pause. Because if that's what this turns into, it's game over, right? It can't possibly go that route. So we have to think about how do we create a sustainable embedded model for business, social business, and the base of the pyramid. And I think one of the core lessons over the last 10 years, to me, comes from this very kind of another, not really a formula, but kind of, that there's been a tendency to assume, and I think this will figure into what you're doing with your, you know, the new initiatives you want to propose, that if we just understand the need, right, there are these big needs, you know, there's drinking water problems and malnutrition, you know, and lack of access to health care. We know there are huge needs. There are stacks of UN reports. We don't need any more data on telling us how severe and significant the problems are. We know that. Wouldn't you say? You know, we don't need any more data to convince us of that. But yet we sort of assume that if there's a big need, that we can create a business there. And unfortunately, that's just not the case. That need's not the same thing as generating demand. They're not the same thing. And I think there's also been this implicit assumption that if we do our work, our homework, we do the marketing research, we go out and collect data, do household surveys, figure out what the expenditure patterns are, hold focus groups, and we figure out what's affordable, and we hit that price point, design it right, that it'll sell. And I think we now know that that's just not the case either, right? That just because something is, quote, affordable, doesn't mean that people are going to buy it. So these are two very important, I think, conclusions and realizations to come to. That as Western capitalists, right, like we are, right, and with most of our experience being in the served market space at the top of the pyramid, what most companies have really become good at is creating new needs in already existing markets. And so most of the marketing research tools and techniques are devised to do that. Unfortunately, the challenge when it comes to the poor and underserved is exactly the opposite. The challenge is to create markets that don't exist from existing needs. That's a completely different challenge. That's why you need new skills and capabilities in order to do it. And so I come to a question, I know we're running out of time, so I just wanted to talk about a couple more things and we'll have time for some questions. So what does it take to do that effectively? Right? So we've got this environmental challenge with the green leap. Now, how do we really create an embedded business that's going to fly, right? That's going to be pulled in by the community because it's so good, not just some cheap product that we're trying to sell. So I asked the question, why have these things taken off? Right? Because every one of them has, whether it's treadle pumps, which have just absolutely exploded across Africa and Asia. Microfinance, right, with Professor Yunus. Rural telephony, starting with a mobile phone, but now it's an explosive business all over the world. We've gone from 1 billion to now close to 4 billion people with access to telephony. Why have these things taken off? There's been such wild, explosive growth when it comes to this stuff. Because there has, right? I'm asking, but then I'll give you an answer. We could spend some time getting your thoughts on it, but I'll show you. Here's my view, here's my take on it. That when you think about it, every one of these really is not an end product. Every one of them is an enabling platform to do something else. Yeah? What microfinance, nobody wants microfinance, nobody's buying microfinance. Nobody's buying, when it comes to rural areas, it's not so much to have the cell phone, although increasingly it is, as they get cooler. But it's what they can do. Right? They're enabling platforms. Microfinance, you use microfinance credit to do any number of things, right, that are going to benefit you, generate livelihood, improve your life. Rural telephony, there are hundreds of uses that these phones have been put to that the telecom people never anticipated. Coming up with codes for a number of rings to communicate. Just really ingenious stuff that the users themselves figured out. They're enabling platforms. In other words, they're not closed value propositions. They're open-ended. It allows for some open innovation. Yeah? And so I'm convinced that this guy really cracked the code on what we need to do. You know who this is? No good reason to know. This is none other than Franz Schubert. And I think when he composed the Unfinished Symphony in 1822, he had actually figured out what we have to do to be successful as social entrepreneurs. And it is quite simply, write the Unfinished Symphony. Don't write the symphony complete to the last note and create a closed-ended value proposition. Because that's, when you think about it, is very arrogant. It assumes we know everything and people in the community know nothing that's important. What makes those enabling platforms examples of this is exactly, they're Unfinished Symphony, right? They're essentially, you use microfinance to write the symphony for yourself, right? So as a company, you want to come in, and as an entrepreneur, with a few bars, you have to have something. You don't want to come in with your hands empty. You have to have a few bars so that people have a sense for what the tune is. But then you want to engage in a collaboration and a co-creation with people in the community where they can bring their own musical capability, their own knowledge and skills, and join it together with you to write the rest of the symphony together. That's co-creation. That's absolutely essential, I'm convinced, in order to generate successful social businesses, base of the pyramid enterprises, and so forth. And so think in terms of the unfinished symphony, think in terms of a co-creation process where you're able to fuse together the knowledge and skills and capabilities of the people in the community, and those become part of the business concept and the business model. You join it together and create something that neither could have on their own. So with my colleagues, we've developed this approach called the Base of the Pyramid Protocol, which, if you just Google that, you can find out a whole lot more about it. It's an organized business entrepreneurship process to co-create businesses with Base of the Pyramid communities. So in short, and I guess maybe where I'll stop is by saying, we're moving from the mindset of finding a fortune at the bottom of the pyramid, right? Like you go get the bag of money, to the mindset of creating a fortune with the base of the pyramid. That really becomes the key in all of this. So let me stop there and say thank you to all of you, and I know there's time, a little bit of time still for some questions. So hopefully that's useful, helpful, and we can continue the conversation. Thank you.